The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
While hopes ebb and flow around the potential democratizing effects of the internet, social media at first seemed tailor-made for it. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Tonight's look back to the archives captures the expectations then and even now for digital platforms to bring people more democracy, not less. A decade ago, social media was seen in a very different light than it is today, including a starring role in what was referred to as the Arab Spring. The pro-democracy protest began in Tunisia in late 2010 and spread across the region to include Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain. With the exception of one country, Tunisia, the Arab Spring has not resulted in the anticipated bloom of democracy. We have parts of two past conversations to show you. The first is with Zainab Tufekci from 2011. She is a sociologist who now also writes for the New York Times and The Atlantic. Also, we hear from the Citizen Lab's Ron Deibert from earlier this year on why, a decade later, social media has yet to reach its democratizing potential.
What role did social media play in triggering, helping, aiding, and abetting the uprising in Tunisia, which we've now seen spread to Egypt? And what my position on this is that clearly social media have played a role in enabling the populations of these countries coordinate, communicate, and create a counter-public sphere, a public sphere in which they could talk to one another about their views that was not directly censorable by the state. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that these dictatorships and authoritarian regimes have been able to withstand 30 years of stability to be undermined at this particular juncture in history. Now, it doesn't mean, and this is something that we can't repeat enough, it doesn't mean that social media caused the grievances, not at all. Obviously, these people have been living under authoritarian, corrupt regimes with high unemployment and lots of other grievances. It's just there hasn't been this ability to come together and to create a voice that could then do what we've seen in Tunisia and we are watching very intently in Egypt.
Let's do some comparing and contrasting here, because there is the Tunisia/Egypt example that we're seeing today. But then a couple of years ago, we also saw Iran and Moldova attempt to do something with social media, and it didn't quite happen. What would you say are the significant differences in the way social media has been used, or how effective it's been in those two different examples?
Well, social media is just one variable among many others in determining whether or not an opposition uprising succeeds or not. It is not some magic wand that the opposition can wave and ensure success. And I think in the case in Iran, the regime was able to suppress and crush dissidents. Now, I think a better comparison would be a couple years ago in Tunisia and Tunisia now. In 2008, there was an uprising of a similar kind of the one that triggered the current successful revolution in Tunisian mining town of Gaffa, where there was a very corrupt management of basically the sole employer that was awash in nepotism, and the protests at that time were widespread in Gaffa, in that town. They were very popular among the populace of that town. But what happened was the regime was able to crush and censor those protests before they were able to get out of that little town. And at that time, the number of Facebook users in Tunisia was 28,000. When the Sidi Bouzid protest started, the number of Facebook users in Tunisia was approaching 2 million. So I think a difference in a couple million people in just 2 years, one shows how important social media can be to the lives of people, because they took up these platforms very rapidly. I mean, from 0 to 2 million in just 2 years. And two, I think it shows that, and it's not just social media, it's also Al Jazeera and the media ecology that's changed, that made it impossible for Ben Ali's regime to contain Sudi Bouzid in Sudi Bouzid using its old trio of censor, repress, crush.
Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote in the New Yorker that, people did demonstrate, revolutions did happen. This stuff did take place before Facebook was invented, in fact, before the internet was invented. So, I gather he's asking the question, can you really give that much credit to social media for what's happening in the streets, since there's nothing new about people getting into the streets trying to overthrow their governments? What do you say?
Well, frankly, I think that position is almost too silly to take seriously, with all due respect. Because, I mean, people fought wars, say, before the invention of gun or before the invention of nuclear weapons. But it would be silly to claim that nuclear weapons do not make a difference in how wars are fought, or whether they're fought, or what happens if they're fought. So obviously people did protest before there was Facebook. People also protested before there was writing, before there was newspapers, before there was television. I mean, that's just, it almost says, people survived the Pleistocene era too. It just doesn't mean that fire is irrelevant. The current discussion should be about what role did these play, and how effective they were. And also, we should also try to understand how authoritarian regimes have been trying to counter this by censorship, by spamming, by trolling, by using it to capture dissidents. So there are very, very interesting questions in terms of studying the social media and this kind of political protest. But to say that, well, people protested before social media, well, true, people also, did protest before television, but I think it would be naive to think that the spread of television has made no difference to the political landscape.
I'm sure social media advocates were quite moved by what President Obama had to say at the end of last month when he said, "The people of Egypt have rights that are universal. That includes the right to peaceful assembly and association, the right to free speech, and the ability to determine their own destiny. These are human rights, and the United States will stand up for them everywhere. I also," the president said, "call upon the Egyptian government to reverse the actions that they've taken to interfere with access to the internet, with cell phone service, and to social networks that do so much to connect people in the 21st century." Now, the president mentioned social media in the same breath as real protests, as traditional forms of dissent, free speech, peaceful assembly, all of that. He's kind of elevated it to a place, if you like, in the pantheon of the most important human rights that you'd see in the First Amendment of the U.S. What did you make of that when he said that?
I have two things to say. I have two things to say. I do agree that social media and the right to assemble, whether offline or online, are fundamental human rights. I do agree that people should be getting together in whatever new communication technologies or old communication technologies. So I appreciate that. On the other hand, I also appreciate it being seen within the whole context. I mean, in the case of the United States, there's that $1.3 billion mostly in military purchases that goes to Egypt every year. So while social media is very important, we should also not forget that repression and the barriers to right to assembly come in many forms, including guns, tanks, tear gas canisters. So it should be part of a broad discussion of the rights of the people of Egypt. And just concentrating on social media would not be the right thing to do. I agree that social media is very important, but it's not that, if you just have free social media while the regime is able to ruthlessly crush, kill, and jail the people, it's not going to work either. The social media is not, as I said in the beginning, it's not a magic wand. So for the United States administration, which has so much leverage in this particular case, I would hope to see internet freedom to be part of a broad agenda of supporting the very justified aspirations of people of Egypt to democracy.
Okay, Zainab, we're down to our last minute here, and let me try one more thing with you. Clay Shirky, whom I'm sure you know, the NYU writer in residence, asked this question in a recent piece in Foreign Affairs. How much can privately held companies such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube be expected ultimately to support freedom of speech and assembly? What do you say to that?
That is a very good question, because what has happened is our social commons have moved online, right? Just as our commons, like printing press has brought about newspapers, just as the new commons emerge out of the printing press, we have a new social and political commons. For good or bad, these commons are currently held by, in their key junctures, are held by private companies like Facebook and Twitter and Google and other companies. And they have been varied in terms of their support for people's use of these platforms in authoritarian regimes. For example, Facebook's policy of forcing its users to always use real names has caused real trouble for Egyptian activists who are using pseudonyms, obviously to protect themselves from repression. And it took some time, and Facebook has been showing some flexibility, but it's unfortunate. It shouldn't have to wait for a light bulb moment in Silicon Valley for these platforms to react and respond to the role that they are in as our social commons. And I think this is especially important since all of these, Facebook and Twitter, have been co-created by the users. Tweet by tweet, status update by status update. These people, the people around the world, Facebook's 500 million users have created this platform. And I do hope that these companies sort of dialogue with human rights activists and others to try to fulfill this very honorable role it is. It's a very, important role to help the aspirations of people around the world.
The entire edifice of this environment that we're relying on to communicate, organize our lives, share information, has some real structural problems. It's kind of like we've quickly built a second floor addition to our house, but the foundation has been rotting for quite a while. So it's either going to collapse on us or make us sick, which is, really underscores the point I'm trying to make in this book. We've got limited time to get this right. In fact, the pandemic has accelerated our dependence on this technology in ways that are potentially very harmful. We need to take a step back and adjust and maybe take a different tack.
Let's pull a quote out of the book here as we continue our discussion. On the surface, it may seem like they're serving us, their customers, something useful and fun, but deeper down, we have become their raw material, something akin to unwitting livestock for their massive data farms. What do you think we need to know about the underlying business model of social media?
The underlying business model is really, in my view, the key that one needs to have in order to unlock all of the social pathologies that follow from it. It's really critical to understand. And the best way to get at it, I think, was expressed by Shoshana Zuboff, business management professor, in a book she wrote called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Surveillance capitalism is a nice description for the underlying business model of all social media applications and increasingly many other sectors of the economy as well. So the way to think about this is regardless of how the companies present their products and services, how they describe themselves, connecting us to friends and family members and so on, putting all the world's information at our fingertips, at root, they're primarily about one thing, and that is to gather as much information as they possibly can from us, their users, in exchange for the use of their products and services in order to monetize that data, to sell it to advertisers and other business clients, and increasingly to governments. And that underlying business model leads to a lot of other secondary consequences and effects that explain a lot of the problems that I identify in the book around social media. And that's why it's important to start there.
Yeah, once upon a time, that seemed like a pretty reasonable deal, right? We get this fantastic free service to be able to connect with anybody we want in the world. We can show all our baby pictures to whoever we want. And it didn't seem like much of a downside. But I wonder now, clearly we are getting a better understanding of what the downside is. And I wonder whether part of it, the business model as you've described, in some respects, does it count on us or rely on us being even more toxic and stirring up even more emotion and getting even more people sucked into this morass than before?
It could be. I mean, if you think back to the core rationale of the business model, what the imperative is here, it's to capture and retain users, because that's the object of the business, is to acquire data from us, pushing more and more sensors closer and closer to us, our refrigerators, our cars, our toasters, our Fitbits, and so on, even increasingly talking about neural implants. So the idea here is to get as much data from us as possible. Now, in order to do that, in order to capture and retain users' interests, the platforms invest a lot in understanding human emotions and what are certain mechanisms and ways of designing their products, and what are the types of content that capture and retain our interest. Now, human nature being what it is, we tend to be, unfortunately, attracted to content that is extreme, sensational, emotional, conspiratorial. And so the platform's algorithms select out that type of content and prioritize. In other words, they propel it forward. And that helps explain why many of us experience Twitter and other social media platforms as is often described a kind of toxic mess.
Yeah, it was all well and good until it started to subvert and undermine democracy, eh?
That's right. I mean, this is, one of the other many consequences, inadvertent, I'll say. The designers of the technology, the CEOs, they didn't set out to, undermine the public sphere and ruin the environment, the ecosystem for our deliberations, or subvert democracy, if you will. But it's often difficult to control the consequences of any technology, especially when it's pushed out to billions of people. One specific thing that I talk about in the book is the way in which social media and the entire communications ecosystem helps propel forward authoritarianism. And it really happens in two ways. One is around what we just talked about, this environment on the content layer, if you will, the fact that you have content that's pushed forward at a very rapid pace, that's emotional, extreme, and so on. It really makes it difficult for people to do things like, say, fact check, to stop, slow down, and really examine claims. But it also turns out to be the perfect environment for those who wish to sow chaos and division and undermine systems of accountability. And we see a lot of that gets a lot of attention with respect to Russia and its disinformation influence operations. Well, Russia is not alone. There are many governments out there that are beginning to see social media as a kind of giant disinformation laboratory. And the aim here is not really to push a particular ideology. It's not to push an agenda. It's simply to confuse, distract, disorient, and ultimately kind of bring about a political paralysis through fatigue. So you start questioning, what's real or not, what's the truth or not, can I believe anything? That serves their end. The other way in which it really helps authoritarian practices is by the inherent insecurity. So as I said, the aim of these technology platforms is to push more and more sensors out, more and more applications constantly to get closer and closer to us. So you have this ecosystem that is invasive by design, but highly insecure. Security is largely an afterthought. Mark Zuckerberg had this famous phrase to describe Facebook's mission to move fast and break things. So they're not really thinking about security. And that's why we see all of these data breaches happening all the time. And it's poorly regulated. So those characteristics together create enormous opportunities for well-resourced, malintentioned actors to abuse power, to effectively get inside their adversaries' networks and neutralize them. And that is what we at Citizen Lab have been tracking over the last decade, is the growth in this very insidious type of targeted cyber espionage targeting journalists, human rights defenders, and others. And again, this is not a design feature. It's not something they set out to do. It's an accidental byproduct of the environment that we've kind of sleepwalked into, if you will.
Well, let's introduce another thought, this one from the well-known historian Yuval Noah Harari, who said, "Our society is built on the ideas that the voter knows best, that the customer is always right, that the ultimate authority is with the feelings of human beings, and this assumes that human feelings and human choices are these sacred arenas which cannot be hacked, which cannot be manipulated. Maybe the most important fact about living in the 21st century is that we are now hackable animals." You agree with him on that?
I do in part. I think what he's getting at there is the idea that Shoshana Zuboff also mentions, the theorist that I talked about, the author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, that with these platforms having access to so much data about our most intimate lives, they are able to nudge us in certain directions, shape the way that we think. Certainly that's something we need to be aware of and be mindful of the negative consequences around it. No doubt about it. I came away after looking into this area convinced that at the very least, the companies are putting a lot of resources from behavioral psychology and real live experiments, kind of A/B tests on a grand mass scale, billions of people, to see if their preferences can be shaped in this direction or that. The reality is a lot of it is a bit of snake oil too. So the companies, especially in this kind of cesspool underlayer of data brokers, location trackers, and advertising companies, oversell their products, oversell what they're doing. The more serious risk around hacking individuals, hacking humans, if you will, has to do with what I just described, frankly. The fact that we are carrying around with us these devices that drill into our lives. Put aside for a minute whether they can manipulate us emotionally. The fact that we carry around these highly invasive devices that surround us in our homes creates this enormous opportunity for exploitation by bad actors. And I'm not talking about people who want to, make us think a certain way. I'm talking about, say, Saudi intelligence wanting to find out what the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi is planning, who's he meeting with, and what we can do to effectively neutralize that. This wild west of targeted espionage that I'm describing is out of control. And I'd say that's the at least the more principal concern right now. Harari may be looking over the horizon. And if that's the case, I agree with him.
One of the things you do call for in the book is the notion of all of us practicing just a little bit more restraint. Now, that is something that very few of us have figured out how to do so far. What makes you think we're capable of it going forward?
Well, the reason I think we're capable of doing it is, historically speaking, human beings have thought about problems not quite like this, but analogous ones throughout human history, going all the way back to ancient Greece. And what I do at the end of the book is not so much put forward a series of recommendations as I say, look, there is a recipe, a tradition of thinking about security and liberty that people have drawn from over millennia to think about the problems around the organization of our political life. And specifically, this idea of restraint comes from that family of theorizing known as liberal republicanism. So restraint is really at the core of this family of political theorizing or political philosophy, applied not just to governments, but to the private sector and to civil society and to ourselves. At the core of this notion of restraint is the idea that humans are subject to faults. We have limitations because of our nature. We tend to be self-interested, greedy. We tend to abuse power. Corruption is endemic to human societies, especially when you have large organizations like the state or big companies. And so the idea from liberal Republican thinkers is there are restraint mechanisms that we need to design into our societies to prevent the concentration and abuse of power. And that's really where this seemingly simple concept of restraint actually is embedded in a much larger, deeper historical tradition that I draw from.
There's just so much money in the cable companies continuing to foment I was going to say revolution, but let's just say unrest. There's so much in it for big tech to continue to foment the toxicity that passes for dialogue on social media these days. I mean, you and I could both list off several other sectors in American society whose self-interest is in perpetuating the status quo and the food fight.
Yeah.
How do we, in some respects, I'm asking the same question again, but I'm not sure where you get the optimism to say, I think we can get out of this mess. I don't know where that's coming from, Ron. Help me out.
Well, let me first say that I could make the picture even bleaker if we add into the equation China and what's going on in China and the technological innovation coming out of China, showing that you can have this one-party authoritarian system with technological innovation, and Chinese platforms are spreading globally. So the challenges are no doubt daunting. I don't pretend it's otherwise. However, the question I would throw back at you is, what is the alternative? Do we just simply resign ourselves to the world we live in and the chaotic mess surrounding us? Do we literally take our devices, throw them in Lake Ontario and say, to hell with it, I'm done? Many people might conclude that's the only viable option. I don't believe that. I do think we have an opportunity here. There is, as I said at the outset, a kind of gestalt in the air. I'm sure you see it too. The very fact that you recognize that social media has this kind of toxic mess characteristic to it is a hopeful sign, because it means you won't just accept it. And then that leads you to thinking, well, what can we do about it? So if you look over the last 6 months to a year, there have been hearings in US Congress. People are talking seriously about antitrust, which itself is a restraint mechanism on companies. There are some very intelligent steps we can take together. And the way I would start to end on a hopeful note is at the local level. We can borrow an analogy from environmental movements where they say, think globally, start locally. Well, let's look at our municipalities. It wasn't that long ago that Alphabet, the parent company of Google, was talking about developing Toronto as a so-called smart city. That was shelved. But what was encouraging was the fact that you had civil society in Toronto really concertedly asking for greater civic accountability, pressing the company, pressing the authorities. We need to do the same with local law enforcement. So if we all start locally, we can bring about some of the restraint mechanisms that I describe in the book around the most immediate aspects of our lives and work outwards from there.
And that's it for tonight's agenda in the summer. Tomorrow, we'll pick up on the personal side of social media, how it's influencing our relationships and our ability to have conversations. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. And we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.